Is God the source of all that is good? Of course, before we get arguing this topic, we had to define what good is. The definition that I prefer is one proposed by Scott Clifton, better known on YouTube as theoretical bullshit. In a video that he made called A Treatise on Morality, he said that a particular action or choice is moral or right if it somehow promotes happiness, well-being, or health, or if it somehow minimizes unnecessary harm or suffering, or both. I like that definition. I think it applies to good, especially since the counter definition, of course, would be bad. While Mr. Lepp has a different definition, he has agreed that my definition does not contradict his, even though it does seem to contradict God. Is God the source of all that is good? Genesis 1:31. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. So venomous stings and poisonous plants and infectious bacteria, mosquitoes, fleas, and crippling parasitic worms are not just good, they're very good. And don't give me that nonsense about the fall either. We know better than that because we've got fossils of dinosaurs that show symptoms of cancer millions of years before we made up fossils for the gods we invented. I could also point out that the galaxy extends billions of light years in every direction, and that of the trillions of galaxies, each of the trillions of galaxies have hundreds of billions of planets that could not support us, that we can only survive temporarily on a portion of the skin of this one mote of dust in an incomprehensibly vast cosmos that would kill us instantly everywhere else, proving that the universe was not created with us in mind. But we'll stick to biology. So we're talking about cheetahs chasing down gazelles and crocodiles ambushing anything that needed a drink of water, and giant eagles, lizards, and snakes eating children in the tropics. It is, as the poet Tennyson said, "Who trusted God was love, indeed, and love creation's final law, though nature, red in tooth and claw, with ravage shrieked against this creed." If you believe in God, then you believe that God made the plants so that they could create their own food, but he left us animals dependent on devouring other living things so that we would die in agony ourselves if we didn't violently kill something else. So pain and death and suffering, predation, starvation, and disease are all apparently good. According to God, every form of evil is, which of course brings us to the next question. Is God the source of all that is good or bad? Whether God is the source of evil as well may seem a trivial point to some, but it's important enough for me to bring it up. If God is the source of all that is, then that negates whether half of that is good. It would be pointless to bring it up without contrasting that with the balance to his dark side. And there are other problems with that I'll get to in a moment. If God were the source of all good, as we read in the sacred fables, then he's the source of all evil too. Isaiah 45 quotes God as saying, "I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord." Oh, excuse me, I'm out of place. "I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things." This is according to the Bible, the Old Testament, the Tanakh, the common ancestor of all Abrahamic monotheism, including each of the many contradictory denominations of the three most violently conflicted religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And when I was a little boy, I remember all I heard on the news was how Christians, Jews, and Muslims tended to kill each other everywhere they mingled, and very often killing themselves, over which factless fantasy each faction liked more. So I had to wonder how it is that all these religions worship the same God of peaceful, loving forgiveness, and yet they were all at war with each other continuously, each since their inception. And it goes beyond the Abrahamic religions too. Hindus and Sikhs and pagans have all been locked in the violence of irrational beliefs and the reactionary hatred that typically generates. So it seems to me that if God was what so many of his followers say he is, then what we see cannot be. Because there are people who say that God is good, but according to Catholicism, which makes up over half of Christianity, they say that God is encumbered with over half of the deadly sins: vanity, jealousy, vengeance, and wrath. And these are not good. These are bad, as in immoral, as in evil. So what if it's a deistic God, and maybe it's responsible for everything, including the good nature of people who could never believe in gods and ghosts and things like that? Well, that would be a neutral God. But that wouldn't be the Bible God, would it? Because the Bible God will torture you mercilessly forever, not on the quality of your character or on the deeds you've done in life, but rather over what you believed, as if that even mattered. This is a central aspect of God's character, and it is neither righteous nor just. It is indefensible, unfair, and wholly evil. According to the Bible, whether you're damned or saved has nothing to do with morality. That's not what you're being judged on. You don't have to keep any of the hundreds of commandments, even though Jesus said that you had to observe every one. Jesus said that you had to follow all of these commandments in the Old Testament, that you had to keep the Feast of the Leavened Bread, sacrifice the first of your harvest to God, kill everyone who believes differently than you do, and don't make any artistic renderings of any living things, and so on. According to Jesus, if you disobey any of these 613 commandments, you will be considered least in the kingdom of heaven. But who cares what they call you as long as you get into heaven, right? Because sin doesn't lead to damnation. Disbelief does. All that matters is whether you believe. It doesn't matter how evil you are. All sins can be forgiven if you but believe. But if you don't believe, then it doesn't matter how good you are, because the only sin that will not be forgiven is the sin of disbelief. Because the Christian God doesn't care about morality. Gullibility is the sole criteria for redemption. So is God the source of all that is good? Meaning, does God prompt or promote good? Certainly not according to the Bible. The Bible is a deeply repugnant tome which celebrates evil, promotes ignorance, and punishes wisdom as an abominable sin. But it doesn't just denigrate science or promote superstition. It also utterly fails as a moral guide, because it was written by ignorant and bigoted savages who condoned and promoted animal cruelty, incest, slavery, abuse of slaves, spousal abuse, child molestation, abortion, pillage, murder, cannibalism, genocide, and prejudice against race, nationality, religion, sex, and sexual orientation. Why? Just to justify their own inhuman bigotry and cruelty by claiming an unquestionable authority from a powerful genie that just happened to be one of their own imagining. Of course they were the chosen people. They chose that God to say so. Some religious leaders, including Mother Teresa, argued that suffering glorifies God, and that's why euthanasia and suicide are the only forms of killing the Bible doesn't endorse. And this is why Richard Dawkins said that the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgivable control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. According to biblical mythology, God set an inevitable trap for a naive couple who didn't know any better. If you have people that don't know the difference between right and wrong, they're going to do something wrong eventually. You don't have to have omniscience to know that. And you don't have to put the cursed tree where you know it doesn't belong, and you wouldn't if you were omniscient or expected any other result. You wouldn't put the talking snake there to seal the deal either. Now, in this debate, it's important what the Bible says, because so many people can't distinguish doctrine from deity. So that if you disprove the Bible, you disprove God, because they can't imagine how God can exist if the Bible were nothing but the fables of men with no truth to it, which is all the Bible is. There is no truth to the scriptures beyond what moral you could have just as easily have gleaned from the fables of Aesop. So I realize that even if God exists, the Garden of Eden is strictly metaphorical. That's all it can be, with no connection to reality. But it always confused me as a kid how God could punish people who he knew didn't know any better, and he knew that he's the reason they didn't, and he's the reason that they did it. He set the trap, and then once it was sprung, he heaped on a bunch of additional punishments instead of what he said would happen. Can't God keep his word? Learning right from wrong is a good thing. So why would he punish us for something he should praise us for? And why is it a condition of our forgiveness that he can't forgive us until we do something unforgivable first, like killing Jesus on the cross, which is another thing that I don't believe really happened. For one thing, it's not unnecessary. For another, a scapegoat sacrifice is immoral as well. Why does unconditional love have so many conditions? It certainly isn't good. But if we hypothetically consider henotheism for a moment, that all religions have a kernel of truth, or that they all share some common truth, then we have to consider Vedic and other scriptures of Hinduism, the oldest religion in continuous practice. Even there, the Godhead is capricious and at times villainous. The Bhagavad Gita promotes the caste system. The Quran promotes child molestation, and both advocate the slaughter of unbelievers, just like the Bible does. So it doesn't matter which version of God you subscribe to. They're all so bad, none can be called good. So is God the source of good? because there's clearly good in the world, but it clearly does not come from God. So there have to be other sources. My first public speech was a keynote explanation of the evolution of morality at a college in Florida at the invitation of the James Randi Educational Foundation. At that time, I explained that animals that are raised in dependence by a nurturing mother are also the species that show empathy for others, and that man is a social animal with an innate sense of compassion for our family, friends, and fellows. This is true of all social animals. Anybody with a dog should be able to see that. Those who collaborate and support the common good are the most beneficial and the most productive, while deviants tend to be ostracized, imprisoned, banished, or killed. So our concept of morality is actually an emergent property of population mechanics driven by very strong selective pressure. As a result, we've even developed mirror neurons to enhance our empathy with others, where those without that, and this is further advanced by overdevelopment of the frontal lobes, where those lacking that tend to be more selfish, short-sighted, cruel, and reactionary. All social animals, including humans, have a sense of compassion, which in some species leads to acts of devotion, defense, and even altruistic self-sacrifice on behalf of another, with or without God. That is written into us as a result of our evolution as a social animal. The God of the gaps argument, so commonly employed throughout fundamentalism, allows that a God is or does whatever science hasn't explained yet, so that once science has explained something, that's no longer attributed to God, in which case we got this. Religion has to pretend that we can't explain the emergence of consciousness or of morality, but science has explained these things and is the only thing that can explain them. But religion makes us go against our nature. For example, Nobel laureate Steven Weinberg famously said, "Religion is an insult to human dignity. With or without it, you have good people doing good things and evil people doing evil things. But to get good people to do evil things, that takes religion." Likewise, Voltaire said, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." And this is to say nothing of the heinous history of holy wars, inquisitions, and witch hunts, and every manner of subjugation, domination, and terror committed since then, nor of all the criminal negligence commonly and currently attributed to religion all over the news all the time. So while there's all of this hatred that is being performed in the name of God, as if God were the source of all that, God does not appear to be the source of any good. So for those who mistakenly believe that the Bible is the Word of God, despite all of its inconsistencies, absurdities, atrocities, and contradictions, let me remind you of the quote you are so fond of reciting for me. "The fool saith in his heart, there is no God." Psalm 14 and 53, because God repeats himself in a manner exactly like the absent-minded human scribes. From there, the passage continues to talk about atheists. They are corrupt. They have committed abominable deeds. There is none who does good, not even one. Now, this is an absolute statement, such that any exception proves it wrong. So if I mention the charitable donations of wealthy atheists like Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, or secular charities like the United Way, or humanitarian efforts like when the atheist community gathered together every year on Blog TV for a charity telethon benefiting Médecins Sans Frontières, each of these examples individually proves the Bible wrong. Our good clearly does not come from God. Is God the source of all good? Some argue that it's not necessarily God who brings good, but rather belief in God that prompts people to do good. And the church may help meth heads by replacing one addiction for another. And they do offer a bit of fellowship to the deluded, as long as they maintain the delusion. But if they ever have a bake sale or a charity drive, it is a PR stunt that is too little, too late to save their image as manipulative, oppressive, tax-dodging scam artists lying to children about things that can't possibly be true. Christians sometimes say that without the threat of an inescapable punishment from an indomitable despot, that humans have no compulsion to do good on their own. And they tell me that if they didn't think that there was a God to judge them, that they'd run around killing and raping, as if that's supposed to convince me that they're the moral ones and I'm not. They know that I'm an atheist and I don't act like that. So why didn't Carl Sagan or Christopher Hitchens or even Jack Nicholson act like that? Think about it. Barry Manilow is an atheist. Bill Cosby is a Christian. In fact, there's a negative statistical correlation between religiosity and what we typically think of as moral behavior. Convicted felons are commonly estimated to be overwhelmingly religious, while the estimated number of atheists in prisons is always substantially lower than among free-roaming citizens. The factions of dominant religions statistically have the highest crime rate, with special emphasis on hate crimes. Religious people tend to support that prisoners should be tortured or killed, where non-religious people tend to say that that is morally wrong. But it gets worse. The most religious countries have the highest murder rate, and the same is true of the most religious areas of the United States. The higher the religiosity of a given populace, the higher the murder rate. Nations that are more secular show the opposite tendency. The less religious they are, the more peaceful they tend to be. Here in America, evangelical Christians have the highest divorce rate and the highest rates of teen pregnancy, especially where they teach abstinence only. Here in Texas, of course, we have the highest rates of repeat teen pregnancy. But it gets even worse. Students in private religious schools are statistically more likely to get an abortion than those in their peers in public schools. This is hypocrisy, and it shows what a failure the policies of the religious right have always been. But it gets even worse than that. Child Protective Services and other agencies report that a significant majority of child abusers and molesters identified as very religious, and the more religious they are, the worse offenders they are. Yet religious people argue that the less religious we are, the less moral we are. Because without God, they think we can have no objective moral standards. But God's morals are his own subjective, inconsistent, arbitrary opinions, or rather, the opinions of those criminal con men who are pretending to speak for him. It can't be objective unless it is independently defined. So I submit that my definition of good is an objective moral standard such as God has never presented and that he can't live up to. Good is inconsistent with God. We are good without God because it's natural to be so, and it's getting more natural all the time. As Stephen Pinker points out in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, history shows a consistent trend toward tolerance and away from violence. We're getting better all the time, but religion wants you to think that everything's getting worse and worse. Is God the source of all that is good? Is God the source of any good? Is God the source of anything? No, because there evidently is no God. Not only is there no evidence for God at all, not one objectively verifiable fact which is positively indicative of or exclusively concordant with that conclusion, but there is substantial evidence that every God ever imagined are just phantasms, creatures of the id. And that the Bible God in particular has been disproved because every testable claim the Bible makes has been disproved beyond redemption, such that not even the existence of God could redeem the Bible anymore. If there is a God, it would have to be a different God. And while there is no evidence of gods or ghosts or any of that, there are arguments. Arguments are not evidence, especially when all of those arguments are empty philosophical sophistry, pretending that we don't know what we know so that we can still make believe something else, or they're logical fallacies. Argument from ignorance and incredulity, argument from probability, appeal to authority, straw man, false dichotomy, anecdotal fallacy. Google the whole list. Every logical fallacy is an argument for God, and vice versa. Asking whether God is the source of all that is good is itself a logical fallacy called begging the question. It's a circular argument routing back to an assumed conclusion, presupposing that a God exists. But it doesn't. The burden of proof is always on the one making the positive claims. Positive claims require positive evidence. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And that which is asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. This is what Christopher Hitchens called the fundamental rules of logic. It is dishonest to assert as fact that which is not evidently true, yet that's what all religions do. Every claim religion makes falls into one of two categories: not evidently true and evidently not true. There is nothing anyone can honestly say they actually know about God, because knowledge is demonstrable, it's measurable, it's testable with measurable accuracy. If you can't show it, you don't know it. It's not enough to assert that something is true. You have to show that it is. And if you can't show that you're right, You're not. One can't just say that anything is possible either, because there's many things that are not possible. And scientists determine whether something is possible by citing some precedent or parallel, or at least some verified phenomenon indicating that such possibility exists. So Mr. Lepp will not only have to show that his God is the source of every good, which we already know he can't do, but he will first have to show that his God is the source of any good. That's a knowledge statement. So he'll have to show how we know that. That means he'll have to show that his God actually exists and explain how it does anything, which again is impossible both for him and for his God. If he could show that, then he would win the Templeton Prize and the Nobel Prize and be a millionaire overnight. But that's not going to happen tonight. If you want to continue to believe in God, you're still going to have to do it on faith, because we are the source of all that is good. But we're also the source of God, and it's not a good God. But fortunately, it's not real either. There really is no God, and that's good.